Okay, we got a lot to cover because I want to. It's getting toward the end of the term. I can't believe it. Anyway, this is the way it is. Okay, we have dollars as the usual demand curve, which we've carried over from the first part of the course. Price on the y-axis, quantity on the x-axis. Demand, this curve is falling. Total revenue can either go up or down depending on the elasticity. Okay, TR. TR is equal to price times quantity. And the other curve here, we have dollars on the y-axis, quantity on the x-axis. We now have a TR curve, which can either go up or down, except that obviously it can only go up from the point of origin since it starts at 0. If you produce and sell 0 TV sets, like I sell no TV sets, okay? And therefore my total revenue from selling TV sets is 0. So we start at the point of origin, 0 quantity, 0 total revenue. And a total revenue curve then has to go up from 0 and goes up and then either goes up or down, etc., in some kind of peak trough situation. To the extent that it goes up, the demand curve is elastic. In other words, this is the area when total revenue is increasing as quantity increases. This is the definition of the demand curve being elastic. In other words, as quantity increases, like so, and total revenue is going up, this means that the demand curve is elastic in that zone. Okay? So this is the elastic demand curve. Then as it goes down, the definition of that is the demand curve is inelastic. In other words, as the quantity goes up, we now get in a situation where total revenue declines. And so, let's say here, as say total revenue is now less. So in that situation, we have an inelastic demand curve, and then it goes up again. Elastic, and then inelastic. Now in the textbook, as I mentioned last time, all these problems are resolved because there's just one peak. In other words, the total revenue curve is drawn like this. And so in that situation, it's very easy. It's elastic here, and then it becomes inelastic. But it doesn't have to be only one peak. It could be several peaks. So I'm drawing it this way to show that in real life, it can be multi-peak. Okay, so you have the total revenue curve, which goes like that, meaning you don't know whether it's going up or down at any given moment. Could be either way. The total cost curve, which I went through last time, is always going up. Total cost curve starts off at 0, the point of origin, regardless of what the book says. In other words, if I am producing no TV sets, I produce no TV sets, I sell no TV sets, therefore my cost incurred in producing TV sets is 0. I start at the point of origin. All the rest of the stuff is purely short run. In other words, if I happen to be, I don't know, Motorola producing TV and I'm retooling for 6 months because the TV sets aren't selling, I might be having fixed costs. But there really are no fixed costs in any sort of long run sense. Okay? Yeah.
Well, you sell them, but
yeah.
You have fixed costs.
Well, not if you're not in the business. I mean, you don't have to be nobody's compelling you to be in the business of selling TV sets. Okay? In other words, I'm not saying, obviously in some short run situations, as you're gearing up, you have costs and then you have revenue. But there's nothing to compel you in the long run to stay in business if you're not selling anything. In other words, the point is that there are no fixed costs after a short run. There's short run fixed costs, but there are no real fixed costs in any real, philosophic sense, so to speak. Also, the variability of the costs vary for any given unit, any given plant. Plants are more or less fixed. Machines are less fixed, et cetera, et cetera. So there are different divisibilities. I'll get into that a little later on today. But the point is there are no fixed costs. Nothing is fixed. I mean, if you figure you're losing money in this business, you get the hell out. You sell the plant, you close down, and you sell the plant. Sell it for scrap if necessary. You know what I mean? You fire everybody, you break your lease or you leave, or you transfer the lease to somebody else, and then you get out. So so-called fixity is only very short run. There's nothing imposed upon you by the divine commandment that some things are fixed and other things are variable. Everything is variable. That's the point of time. All costs are variable at different degrees. Some costs are easier to get rid of than others. For example, if you're in the TV business, you decide to get out. You can immediately stop buying stationery. That's easy. Or buying, quiet please. Hey, quiet. Or you can stop selling, buying paper clips. On the other hand, to fire everybody is a little more difficult. It takes more time, more of a decision, a longer decision sort of thing. So the aim of every firm is to maximize its profits or to minimize its losses, and therefore they're trying to get in a situation where there's the biggest distance between total revenue and total cost. That's their objective, to maximize TR minus TC, or profits. If their luck holds and they're good shape, this will be positive. In some cases, it can be negative. In some cases, you might have this kind of a situation. A total cost curve like that and a total revenue curve like that, then you're in really bad shape. And whatever you do, you're going to lose money. Eventually, of course, you go out of business. You cut your, you raise tuition. That's not a market activity. So, anyway, the maximum profit point of production, you try to produce so that you maximize your profit. The maximum profit, one of the attributes of a maximum profit point of production is that the slope of the tangent of total revenue and total cost are the same. So that if the slope of the tangent of TR and TC is the same, then you've got marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. Okay? Marginal revenue is defined as delta TR over delta Q. In other words, if you produce one more item, one more TV set, one more package of nails, whatever you're selling, produce one more item, how much more total revenue will be brought in by that one more item? That's essentially the slope of the tangent. If you have an infinitesimal degree, the delta becomes infinitesimal and becomes dTR dQ. Marginal cost is also, the reason why I prefer to stick to delta is that in real life, nothing is infinitesimal. In human action, you're buying or selling or producing, it's not infinitesimally small. This is dTC over dQ. So, in other words, if you produce and sell one more unit of the item, how much will this extra unit cost you? And so, the maximum profit point is when the two are more or less equal, when the marginal revenue and marginal cost are equal. Now, the thing is, we should not make too much of this because once you realize there can be more than one peak, as the textbooks never realize, then you can also have a minimal profit. You could be at this situation. The tangents are equal here, slope of the tangent is equal, and yet you're in very bad shape. They're also equal up here. You don't know offhand which is bigger, this or that, unless you actually inspect the data and find out. So the marginal revenue equal marginal cost criterion is a very, very weak one. It only applies if you have only one peak. And it's better if you have the data. If you're a businessman, it's much better to figure out what the total is and not worry about the margin. The only important thing about the margin is that it emphasizes the fact that every step that a businessman takes, every decision a businessman takes, every new unit that he produces, he has to worry about covering costs. He has to figure he's not going to do it unless at least he covers costs. His revenue and costs are equal for this decision. Hopefully, the cost is greater and the revenue is greater than the cost. So that's the major philosophic importance, so to speak, of concentrating on the margin. The rest of it is mostly overblown. The importance is really overblown of this. Okay, average revenue is TR over Q. In other words, if you want to find out, if you're produce and sell 100 units of something, 100 packages of Wheaties or 100 loaves of bread or whatever, what's your average revenue? It's going to be the total you get, total income, divided by the quantity, the income per loaf of bread or income per TV set, which is, of course, is the same thing as the price. In other words, T times Q is equal to TR. So average revenue is the same thing as price. It's another name for price of something. If somebody sells 10 loaves of Wonder Bread and gets $10 for it, it means that the price of the Wonder Bread, the average revenue of the Wonder Bread is $1 per loaf. Okay? So this is our old friend the demand curve. This is the demand curve, the price curve, so to speak. Price and relating price and quantity. Marginal revenue, average cost is equal to total cost per unit. Total cost divided by Q. Also, you can call it average total cost to clearly distinguish. We're not talking about average fixed cost, average variable, and all this other nonsense. I will not talk about fixed and variable costs from now on. So when I talk about average cost, it's average total cost, total cost per unit. It costs you $100,000 to produce and sell 10,000 items, and therefore the cost per item is $10. That sort of thing. Okay, now the relationship between marginal and average. There's a certain relationship between all margins and all averages, and we'll get to that later when we get the labor market and the factor production market too. It's a purely mathematical relationship. It has nothing to do with economics, but it's used in economics, so we should go through it. The relationship is as follows. Supposing, for example, we take the average height of this class. Each of us has a certain height. We total all the heights, and we divide it by whatever it is, 20 people, and we get the average height. Okay? 2 basketball players walk in, and 7-footers. Then we take another average, and of course it's going to pull up the average. Not as much as 7 feet, but it's going to pull it up from whatever it is, 5'8" or whatever it is, to 5'9" or something. So in other words, if an average of X is increasing, then the marginal X is higher than the average. An average of X. In other words, if you see an average if an average is increasing, like the average height of the class increases from now to a half hour from now, it means that new people coming in are higher than the average. Okay? That's why the average is going up. In other words, the increased margin pulls the average up. So if you have an average of anything, this applies not just to height, it applies to anything. Average income, average weight, average whatever, intelligence quotient, whatever it happens to be. If the average is going up, that means that the marginal of the thing, average of X, the marginal of X is higher than the average, whatever it is. On the other hand, the same thing applies the other direction, and all these laws are symmetrical. If we take the average height and 2 midgets walk in, 2 4-footers, it's going to pull down the average. Okay? So it means that the average of something is decreasing. The average of X is decreasing. Then this means that then the marginal of X is less than the average of X. Okay? Might as well make this greater than here. Make this symmetrical. So in other words, if you see an average of something decreasing, it means that the margin is pulling down the average. These 2 midgets or 3 midgets, whatever it is, are pulling down the class average in height. So this is the other law. It's symmetrical to the first one. So that means if you have an average of anything as decreasing, it means that the margin is below the average. Right? So here we have, here we have an average of something. It doesn't matter what it is. Let's say height. It doesn't matter. And this average is going up. So it means the margin is above it somewhere. And if the average is going down, it means the margin is below it somewhere. Okay? The margin is the average. Well, okay, if in that case, okay, this is pretty obvious, but in that case it means that when the average reaches a peak, it reaches a peak point, which means it's constant for that moment, of course. When the average reaches a peak, it must mean that the marginal is equal to the average. It's the only way you can cut through. You can't leap across the dimension here. So it must mean that at the point where the average flattens out before it falls, the margin is equal to it. Okay? In other words, this follows from these 2 points, these 2 axioms here, or whatever you want to call them, propositions. So therefore, okay, when the average of X is at a peak, in other words, when it's constant, okay, then the average of X is equal to the marginal of X. And also it works for the trough point. In other words, really, the average is going down, average of something, and then it goes up, when it goes down, the margin is below it somewhere, the marginal. When the average is going up, the marginal is above it, the average. So this means that when the average flattens out and becomes a trough, at the trough point, the marginal must be equal to it. Right, so this is, Okay, so when the A of x is either a peak or at a trough, because at a peak or a trough the average is constant for that moment, then the average of x is equal to the margin. So this applies to all averages and all marginals. In fact, it applies to everything in life. Just in economics, we just deal with a few things here, but you can carry it over to all of life now. You have this great piece of knowledge which can serve you in good stead forever in all fields of endeavor. Height, weight, IQ tests or whatever. Now, in the case of microeconomics, the average costs, as we'll see in a minute, average costs tend to have a U shape, something like that. We'll see why. Average total cost or average cost. Something like that. In other words, it declines, reaches a trough point, and then goes up. This is dollars on the y-axis, quantity of goods on the x-axis. We haven't demonstrated this yet. We'll demonstrate this a little later. I'm just pointing out, if it has this kind of a U shape, then average cost, marginal cost will always be below it when it's declining, always be above it when it's going up. Okay? Because this follows. When the average of anything falls, the marginal is below it, below the average. When the average of anything is going up, the marginal has to be above the average. And when the average of anything is at a trough point, the marginal is equal to it. So therefore, marginal costs, if the average costs really have some kind of a U-shape, kind of shape, then the marginal cost will be something like that, and they will equal each other at the trough point. Okay? For revenue, it's a little bit different because since the demand curve is always falling, okay, therefore demand is equal to average revenue. So the average revenue is always falling. There's no such thing as a rising average revenue curve. Okay, so this is dollar. And so the marginal revenue will always be below it. In other words, since the average revenue is always falling, it means the marginal revenue is always below it. And it will be like this, as a matter of fact. And eventually it will hit the x-axis, for that matter. Keep going like that. So this accounts for the shape of the marginal curves in the book. In other words, given the average curve, the demand curve is always falling, that sets that. So the marginal curve is always falling, and will always be below it and will actually fall more steeply. You could say that. And if the average curve is U-shaped, and I haven't demonstrated that yet, then the marginal curve will be something like that, intersecting at the trough point. So this is all really mathematics. It's now applied to microeconomics. And later on, we'll see how this applies to productivity curves, things like that. Okay, let's get to the average cost curve then, about why it's U-shaped or whatever. When you think of economy of large-scale production, those of you who have balked at the idea of the total cost curve is always going up, and you say, no, but total cost, how about an automobile plant? Isn't it less costly to have a large-scale production? It's true, but it's for average costs that you're talking about, average total costs. Okay, let's look at the average cost curve. It's not as simple as you might think. Why it is something like U-shaped. Now we get to some more philosophic mathematics, so to speak. This is philosophy of life for the mathematics applied to it. We have in real life, so to speak, the law of cause and effect, which essentially says, given the causal factors, given a certain quantity of causal factors, it will yield a certain result, a certain effect. Okay? And this cause and effect relationship can be replicated at any time or place. Okay? In other words, you can set side by side, you can produce whatever it is. You can produce copper sulfate in a certain way. You produce the same copper sulfate, next week or 2 blocks away, and so forth and so on. So this is a basic law of life, that equal causes yield equal effects. That they have a natural law situation. It's called natural law of nature, natural law situation. Okay, we can express this. We can express this natural law situation in production by mathematical formula. By generalized mathematical formula called the production function. It's a very general law, but it expresses certain basic truths. When a production function says it says as follows: given, it applies to all production of anything. It really applies to any kind of action, for that matter, any kind of quantitative action of any sort. I mean, to buy a sandwich, you have to do certain things. You have to go downstairs. You have to go to Michelangelo's. You have to get the sandwich, all that sort of thing. Pay a certain amount of money. You leave that out. It's a physical production function. What you're saying is this: to produce anything, you need certain end factors of production. You need a certain amount of labor, land, capital, certain types, and so forth and so on. A certain quantity of each factor X, okay? A certain quantity alpha, whatever the quantity is, 5 of it, 3 of it. It will, differ from good to good. I mean, it depends on each good and service. It depends on the technology of it. Alpha of X combined with. This is a symbol for combined with. Huh? What did you say?
In logic service, that is
Exclusive war? What, this? Combined with beta, certain quantity of y, factor y, combined with a certain gamma, a certain quantity of factor z, combined with a bunch of other factors, ... will yield a certain quantity of a product. Q of, I don't know, what's Q of P? P is usually price. Let's make it R. Q of R. Okay, Q of a certain product. In other words, you take a certain amount of factor X, combine it with a certain amount in a certain way, with a certain amount of factor Y, combine it with a certain amount of factor Z, etc., you will get 5 eggs or 3 TV sets or whatever it happens to be. You get a certain quantity of a product. This applies to any product of any sort. It doesn't matter what the actual good or service it happens to be. Okay, this is a generalized production function. But since you have a law of cause and effect, you can replicate it. You can put it side by side somewhere and duplicate it. So you'll have then alpha of X combined with beta of Y combined with gamma of Z, etc. Side by side will produce another Q of R, another 3 TV sets, or another 28 loaves of Wonder Bread, whatever it happens to be. So this means that you can keep adding indefinitely. So therefore, instead of doing that, of course, you can multiply each of these factors by n. So this means that n times alpha combined with n times beta combined with n times gamma will yield n times the product. This follows from the law of cause and effect. So this is our generalized production function. Those of you who are mathematical mavens, this is also called a linear homogeneous production function. Don't ask me what this means, because I'll just state it. So, okay, so this means that from the physical point of view, if you're just from the point of view of physical product, physical factors or whatever, if you're a business firm now, to get back to the firm, and you're hiring factors and you're producing certain things and getting the product, this means that the average cost of everything should be constant. In other words, if to produce produce 100 loaves of Wonder Bread, you need alpha of whatever. To produce 1,000, you need 10 times as much. And we just said this through our basic law of linear homogeneous production function. So this means that the average, therefore, cost, this is dollars, means you need 5 times as much of everything to produce 5 times of the product. So therefore, it should mean that the average cost is horizontal. Average total cost would be horizontal. And since it's obviously not horizontal, the question is how come? Here we have a real problem. It obviously does not cost, if you want to produce 1 car a year, you're not going to build a $100 million automobile plant with all the equipment and grind out with 1 car, because you have an astronomical cost per car. You have a huge fixed cost in the situation. Okay. Now, of course, one thing that violates it right away, of course, is when the price goes up, as we'll see a little later on, also even more. If you keep producing more and more of this thing, grinding out many ends, in other words, producing 10 loaves of Wonder Bread, 10 cars, 100, 1,000, a million, you're going to start bidding up the demand curves of the various factors of labor. In other words, you're buying more, demanding more labor or raw materials or land. You're going to bid the prices up. So the wage rates and raw material prices and all those things will go up. So eventually, even if everything was constant, because of the prices going up, the price of the factors of production, the cost from the point of view of price, in other words, the price of labor, the price of land, raw material, you'll have something like that. So you'll have average cost will then go up. But the real problem is what about the sloping cost, which we know, of course, the average cost falls over a long distance. you start producing. And so the question is, where does that come from? Why do you have a falling average cost curve? Why is it more economic to have a huge assembly line for automobiles, producing 1 million cars a year instead of 5 cars a year? Why isn't it just as, why is it much costlier to have a small automobile plant? And we haven't explained that yet. So in other words, with a philosophy, we have the constant average cost curve, and then knowing that the increase in demand curve will raise the price of raw materials and labor, etc., we can explain the average cost curve going up toward the end. What we can't explain yet is why it falls in the early parts of production. Okay. So, this is the reason why it falls, allegedly violating all of this law of linear homogeneous production function. It doesn't really violate it. The problem is you can't multiply everything by n in real life. That's the problem. In other words, you can't take n times n cubed. You can't multiply each thing by n because each factor of production is a different divisibility. This is the so-called indivisibility problem. You can, for example, multiply paper clips by n. If you're increasing the production of something by tenfold, you're going to have 10 times as many paper clips. There's no problem with that. Or 10 times as much many nails or something like that, which are very divisible. Okay. In other words, some factors of production, some capital goods are very divisible. Others are very indivisible. Just the technological nature of them is very indivisible. You can't multiply the factory by 10. Right? You can have 10 times as many machines maybe, but you can't have 10 times as many factories. The famous case of a very indivisible, there are different degrees of indivisibility. Okay, this is why I'm getting back to this gentleman's point about fixed costs. There are different degrees of fixity. There are different degrees of variability. And the problem with the textbook, they say some costs are fixed and others are variable. Everything is variable, but at different degrees. For example, the most famous case of a very indivisible capital good is a railroad track. Let's say you have a railroad going from here to Boston, and you're doubling the amount of shipments on it because you have more business. Well, you can double the number of railroad cars, maybe. You can double the number of railroad workers and engineers and firemen and stuff. You can't double the track. To double the track is a big thing, a big deal. It takes a long time. You have to lay the track, all the rest of it. It's not very easy. So you have different degrees of indivisibility. Railroad track is one of the most least divisible thing I can think of, one of the most indivisible things. Factories are quite indivisible. Machines are less indivisible. And different machines raw material is very divisible. You can get more, raw material coming through pretty easily. Labor has different degrees of divisibility, et cetera, et cetera. And some things like paper clips are very divisible. So in practice, you can't increase everything by n. Some things can be doubled, other things can't. Some things can be tripled easily. You can quadruple, say, this before you can double this. And so it's because of these degrees of indivisibility, that you have a falling average cost curve. In other words, you start with a plant. Let's say you're producing automobiles. You have a huge plant with a big equipment and all the rest of the stuff before you can produce anything. And if you produce 1 car a year, you got an enormous, $100 million per car cost, because you have this enormous cost in order to gear up for this thing. Because these are all very indivisible. You have a stratospheric average cost problem. As you keep increasing the output, then you lower the overhead cost. In other words, then you begin to have very rapidly decreasing as you start using this very indivisible machine. It's like a big computer. If you have a huge mainframe computer, like in the old days particularly, you have to use it a lot to make it efficient, to bring down the average cost per unit. So as you increase the units of production, you have a very rapid fall in average cost as you keep tapping more and more of the indivisibility. You start using this very indivisible thing. It's like taking a $100 million machine or whatever and using it only once a year, 1 hour a year. It's crazy. It's a very high average cost per unit. So as you keep using it, you lower the indivisibilities, and as you keep increasing the quantity, more and more of the indivisibilities are tapped. In other words, you're using it more and more to more capacity production. As you do that, it finally levels off because you finally begin to use it at capacity. Most entrepreneurs, when they're building a plant, are thinking of a certain range of production they're going to use it. 100 million cars a year or something. They will design a plant in such a way that it'll be the most efficient or lowest average cost, more or less at 1 million a year. This would be a certain range because it's not God-given. This could be the same number of cars for 10 years or 20 years. But more or less they know the range. Nobody thinks of producing 1 car a year. When the automobile industry first started, they grew up in blacksmith shops around 1900, small blacksmith shops, bicycle shops. They produce 1 car a year, or 10 cars a year, or something like that. They were geared for it. That was the most efficient. The lowest average cost is more or less at 10 cars a year. But after they start going into mass production, of course, the whole thing changes. So as you keep increasing the quantity, you finally get to the point where you're more or less using everything to capacity. You start overusing things. And as you keep going, you start overusing various products. You can't gear it in such a way that everything meshes together at once. So as you keep increasing the quantity, you start having problems of overuse, breakdowns of equipment, and the average costs begin to turn up. And then you have, finally, as you get big mass production, the factor enters in of increasing the price of wages and more material, etc. In other words, you have an average cost turning up because the price of the factors of production goes up. As a result of all this, you have something like a U-shaped average cost curve. Because of the problem of indivisibility, you have to get to the point where you're using up the indivisibilities. You're capping using the capacity of all this fixed equipment. But there are different degrees of indivisibility. It's not just some things are fixed and other things are variable. Everything is variable except at different paces, at different rates, at different. And the best way to mesh them together is somewhere around here. It still is not totally meshed together because life doesn't work that way. So you have something like a U-shaped average cost curve. That's the final conclusion. And more or less, you gear it so that, of course, you're usually operating around here in this area. And if you talk to a businessman, if an economist talks to a businessman about their falling average cost, they don't usually know what you're talking about because they don't think in terms of producing 1 car a year or 2 cars a year. Obviously, they're thinking in terms of producing 1 million or so. They're not geared in these kind of hypothetical situations. So most businessmen think, of course, average cost is more or less constant because they're dealing in a zone here, which is more or less in this area. As a matter of fact, probably empirically, in most situations, the average cost curve, there's nothing that says it has to be U-shaped. All we know is it starts off very high, it declines, it reaches a trough point, and then goes up again. And so usually empirically, it's generally something like this. It goes down like this, and there's a plateau, and then it goes up. So most businessmen think of their average cost as constant because they're dealing, of course, in practical reality in this plateau area. They don't deal in the areas where they start having big increases in costs or areas where they're only producing 5 cars a year or something. So more or less you have this plateau situation. And in this situation, of course, marginal costs will be somewhere below it. When average costs are falling, marginal costs are below it, usually around here somewhere, around there. Marginal costs will be higher here, and of course they'll intersect at the trough point. And again, too much is made of this in the textbook. They think, well, boy, this is a great thing. You have to worry about the intersection. But basically, the point is that this marginal costs are set once you give an average cost. And in this situation here, where there's a plateau, marginal costs, of course, will be identical to average costs in this whole range. You have something like that, marginal costs like this, up like that, like that. So this is why most businessmen, if they talk about marginal costs and average costs at all, which they usually don't, they say, well, it's all constant, it's all equal. And it is for them, in the zone of practicality, it is equal. I mean, because this is the region they're dealing with 99% of the time. Okay, so this is basically the average cost, marginal cost shtick. It's of some use, certainly. The idea of indivisibility is important. The average cost curve falling and then being constant and then going up again. And the idea of marginality is important as an idea of focusing on the fact that businessmen are interested in each decision. They want to make a profit on each decision, or at least not make losses in any given decision they're making during the course of the year. Now we take the maximum profit point, or the maximum profit diagram. Remember in our total curve, where the total revenue is like that, and total cost is like that, and this, let's say, this is the maximum profit. In other words, businessmen, if they know the curves, which is a very big if, will tend to produce at this point, where the maximum profit is at the maximum. Transposing that to the average marginal curve, we have then the demand curve is like this, let's say, something like that. And here's the average cost curve and then whatever. And in this case, the marginal revenue curve will be like this. And the marginal cost curve will come up like that. And remember that given the various assumptions, given a one-peak curve, okay, forgetting about multi-peaks, given a one-peak curve, and given this diagram, you can't automatically see what the maximum profit point is. You can in this diagram. See? Pretty obvious, this is the maximum profit point. If you're given only this diagram, the only way you can figure out the maximum profit point is by taking marginal revenue equal marginal cost as the criterion. In other words, this point right here. This will be the point of maximum profit for the firm given these curves, given the situation. In other words, at this point, see, this is this point of production. Let's say this is 1,000 widgets or whatever. At that point, this is where marginal revenue and marginal cost are equal, the only point where they're equal. At that point, the total profit will be the following. Total profit, it will be average revenue times Q, or price times quant Q, right? Total revenue. Return times Q minus. It really be, if you're looking at the averages, total revenue minus total cost. So this is total revenue is average, let's see, average revenue. Average revenue times quantity minus average cost times quantity. So this is the way, this will be maximum profit point. Where in other words, at the point where marginal revenue and marginal costs are equal, average revenue times quantity, the total profit will be average revenue times quantity minus average cost times quantity. In other words, this is average revenue times quantity here, this figure, minus average cost down here times quantity. So the total profit will be this area here. In other words, average revenue minus average cost times quantity. Okay? This is will give you the total profit at the maximum profit point. In other words, at the point where marginal revenue and marginal costs are equal, you then take this minus this. This is on the point of the demand curve minus the point on the average cost curve times quantity. Give me this area. This will be the same as that, as this line here. And this is always big in the textbook. They're always giving you these examples of problems, etc. Find the maximum profit point. You grind it out that way. In real life, of course, business are interested in the total. Why not go for the total? Why worry about the average? But anyway, this is the way it's done on the books. Given only this information, the total profit, the maximum profit point will be the point where these marginal revenue and marginal costs intersect. And at that point, the total profit will be this area. Of course, if you're making losses, then you're in an unfortunate situation such as follows. Here's the demand curve, and here's average cost. You're always below it. And you're in bad shape. So this I guess will be this is marginal cost coming up like that. This is marginal revenue. This will be like the minimum loss point here. So you produce at this level. This will be the loss. Of course, if you keep on like this, you go out of business pretty quickly. I mean, you're not going to hang around and make losses forever. But this would be the minimum loss point. This would be the area of loss then. At the point of intersection, marginal revenue and marginal cost. This would be the minimum loss point where the average cost minus average revenue times quantity is at a minimum. Hopefully, of course, usually in the textbooks, this is the example because you're assuming the firm is making a profit. It doesn't have to make a profit. There's no divine law that says it has to make a profit. So, at any rate, this is essentially production. Theory of production of the firm is essentially this: that the firm tries to make a maximum profit. The maximum profit is determined in a one-peak curve situation, one-peak total revenue curve. It'll be at a point where the slope of the tangents, in other words, marginal revenue and marginal costs are equal. So the marginal revenue cost and marginal cost curves intersect. And at that curve, you can either, this line here in the total diagram is very simple. This is obviously much simpler. Just look at this. This is the This is the profit, total profit is this minus that. In this curve, it's more complicated. It's the area. You subtract average revenue, average cost of average revenue, and multiply by quantity, and that gives you the total profit. Okay, any questions on this? Okay, this is the high-powered stuff of the month. Yeah. Huh? Yeah. Given you're operating altogether, as I say, if you can continue that forever, after a certain line, you just go out of business. This would be the minimum loss area. All the rest of it, all of this is loss because average cost is always above average revenue in this particular diagram. So this is the minimal point, given that I say you're operating at all. So, and given a one-peak curve, a one-peak total revenue curve, if it's two-peak, then all bets are off. You have to look for the, inspect the total. But as I say in the textbook, they never talk about two-peak because that screws up the whole math. I mean, the whole geometry of it screwed up. You can't rely on tangents and all the rest of the things. Okay, let's take a 10-minute break. I'm going to applications here of this analysis, maximum profit thing. If you're here, supposing if you're a business firm, you're here, you're producing this much. You're in the inelastic demand curve zone, in other words. Okay, so you're in this kind of a situation. Price is quantity. So that means that you're in a situation, if you cut your production, let's say this is 1,500, 1,500 units. You cut your production from 1,500 to less than 1,000, of course your total costs go down, because they always go down when you cut production. Okay? But also your total revenue goes up, because you're in an inelastic demand curve for the firm. Therefore, you will do it. If a businessman has any smarts at all, he will get the hell out of this situation, because all he has to do is to cut production. When he cuts production, the total costs go down, the total revenue goes up, and he automatically makes more money. Okay? Therefore, no business firm which has any smarts at all will ever remain in this zone. In other words, he'll always be in this zone here, where even if he doesn't quite hit the maximum profit point, which is difficult to do, since you don't always know what your demand curve is, what your cost curve is. If you see it at all you have to do is to cut costs, and your total revenue goes up. You will do it. And so the conclusion is that every business firm will always produce in an area where the demand curve is elastic. In other words, this area here. This is the rising total revenue curve is the elastic demand curve zone. So it means every firm will have an elastic demand curve, because if they're in an inelastic zone, they'll get out of it. They'll cut production quickly. The reason why they'll cut production and not increase it is because it's very easy to cut production. They can see right away. If you cut production, your costs are lower and your total revenue is up, you'll do it. Okay. So this area is not viable. There's no firm will be in it. So you have a very important conclusion here. The conclusion is that every firm will have an elastic demand curve, will be in an area where its demand curve is elastic. In other words, like so. We've already seen that the demand curve for the firm is more elastic than the demand curve for the industry as a whole, because you have more range of choice for the consumer. Wonder Bread, Pepperidge Farm, whatever, has much more range of choice than bread, period. But now we see more than that. Not only will the demand curve for the firm be more elastic than the demand curve for the industry, it will be elastic, period. In other words, it'll be in a zone where if you cut production, total revenue goes up. If you increase production, cut prices, total revenue goes up. If you raise prices, total revenue will fall. The firm will always be in this zone. Because if the firm is in this zone, we're talking about a firm now, not an industry. Okay? The firm will never be in this zone because it will always be immediately profitable to cut production, cut costs, and raise revenue. No firm will, given any smarts at all, will be in a situation where they're losing money by producing more. Okay, so every firm will have an elastic demand curve. Okay. Now this really covers the theory of costs and demand. We now get to the whole area of monopoly and competition, and I'm going to say it's going to be much shorter than the stuff in the book. We'll deal with some case studies, of course, but basically, the problem with textbook microeconomics is in the 1930s they erected a so-called ideal, which they've been getting away from ever since. I mean, the micro techs are much better now than they were 50 years ago. They still have not thrown over this alleged ideal system. The alleged ideal system, well, look at it this way. And the situation where this is a firm now. demand curve for the firm. We've seen the demand curve for the firm as elastic. It has to be elastic in any for any firm which is trying to maximize its profits. According to the theory of so-called perfect or pure competition, notice the names perfect and pure. It's a value-loaded terminology. Although the economists claim to be value-free and non-emotive, perfect sounds good. I mean, if you say a situation is perfect or pure, it implies that it's a good situation. It's better to be perfect than imperfect. It's better to be pure than impure. Perfect competition or pure competition is defined as a situation where the demand curve for the firm is horizontal. Instead of being simply elastic, where the demand curve for the firm is perfectly elastic or infinitely elastic. That's supposed to be the best situation. Why it's the best we'll go into a little later. To say it's unrealistic is putting it mildly, since it never exists. What it implies is that regardless of how much the firm produces, it won't have to cut price. We've already seen the demand curve is always falling. How can it be horizontal? Well, the theory is it's true the demand curve for the industry is falling, but if each firm is very, very tiny, say the wheat market is a classic case, a big wheat industry, each farm is only 100 acres or 10 acres. If Hiram Jones, wheat farmer in Iowa, increases his production by 10%, it's not going to affect the entire wheat market. On that basis, they claim that the demand curve for each farmer is horizontal, is infinitely elastic. It's not really, because obviously the angel Gabriel came to Hiram Jones and said, look, I can magically increase your production by 1,000,000-fold. It will affect his demand curve. I mean, he'll have to cut the price in order to sell it. As given production, it's very tiny compared to the rest of the industry. Does not improve a product, has a product that's fixed forever. Doesn't compete in any other spectacular way. In that situation, the demand curve would almost look like it's infinitely horizontal. Why is that better? Who knows? There's certain alleged reasons for it, which I think are all phony. But anyway, this is supposed to be the ideal situation. The situation where competition is perfect. Anything else? In other words, in real life, where all demand curves are falling, even for Hiram Jones, certainly for everybody else, every other firm, because if the firm increases, if it doubles its production, it'll have to cut the price in order to sell it. Okay? It faces a falling demand curve. All real life situations are attacked as being, quote, imperfect, or impure, or monopolistic. So the theory of monopoly we've inherited from the 1930s is this very weird theory where the only real competition, only perfect competition, is when each firm faces a horizontal demand curve. And since each firm in reality, including ourselves, I mean, if you become an engineer and you charge your wage rate to a firm, you will face a falling demand curve. In other words, if you insist on tripling your salary, you're going to get a much lower demand for your services. Okay, so everybody is a quote monopolist in that sense, or monopolistic. All life is monopolistic. It's a very peculiar kind of terminology, you see, where everybody becomes a monopolist by definition. So real life, when every firm or every individual or whatever faces a falling demand curve, it's called monopolistic, imperfect, and pure. Now, notice these economists claim to be value-free. They're scientists. They're not passing moral judgments. But look at the moral judgment that's implicit in this. On one hand, you have perfect and pure and quote, competitive. And on the other hand, you have imperfect, impure, and monopolistic, which obviously value-loaded terminology, attacking this as being somehow evil. And the antitrust system from the 1930s until about 20 years ago was designed to try to force industry into this Procrustean bed of being pure, perfect, and where every firm faces a horizontal demand curve. That was the break-up industry. You have these tiny little firms. At any rate, this is, to say the least, not only is it unrealistic, it really is there's no reason to consider this as better. Matter of fact, it's worse to have pure competition than have so-called impure, because the situation every firm faces is so tiny that's going to be almost horizontal demand curve. It's going to be one where every firm is so small, you're not going to tap economies of large-scale production. It'd be very costly for the consumer and for everybody else. But anyway, that's the whole shtick. See, the whole theory of monopoly is, and all the other terms, oligopoly, monopoly, imperfect, it's all the same thing. It all means that a firm is facing a falling demand curve. Now notice what's happened here. What's happened here, that originally the terms monopoly and competition, both in economics and in real life, were defined very differently. up until 30 years ago, 50 years ago, defined competition meant rivalry. It meant, people competing for goods and services. It meant other firms coming in and competing, or other people coming in. That's what competition meant. Monopoly meant government grants of exclusive privilege to one or more firms. As I've already talked about, I'll talk more about now. When the government says only the yellow cab company, let's say in Los Angeles, only the yellow cab company can operate cabs. Nobody else, anybody else who operates a cab is shot or arrested. Okay, if not shot. So in other words, the government grants exclusive privileges to one person or few people or whatever, keeping out all other competitors. That's monopoly. That's what monopoly has always meant until 50 years ago. Then the economists come along and they change the definition. And everybody's against monopoly for good reasons. Because monopoly means, first of all, you're screwing the consumer. You're restricting entry into a firm, into taxi industry or the medical profession or whatever. And you're deliberately then, by restricting entry, you're raising the price that the consumer has to pay and cutting the production. And naturally, consumers are against it if they know what's going on. And competitors are against it. Those are excluded from this little racket. And so the American Revolution, for example, was a revolution against monopoly. It was against the British East India Tea Company and given the monopoly of tea, import of tea into the United States. And most of the early state governments had a constitutional clause in the state constitutions against monopoly. It didn't mean facing a falling demand curve. It meant that the government may not grant exclusive privileges to produce or sell any particular product. They can't say only 3 guys can produce salt or whatever. So it was for good reason why most of the people are against monopoly. And then what these people did, the economists did, was they changed the definition of the term monopoly to mean not a grant of privilege by the government, but facing a falling demand curve, which everybody faces. It means everybody's an evil monopolist, you see, and this changes the whole meaning of the discussion. The competition became not competing for products or making better products or making it cheaper or whatever. Competition meant a horizontal demand curve. It meant not being able to affect your price regardless of how much production you make. It's very weird, and yet this conquered the economics profession at the same time when Keynesianism and macroeconomics also conquered it. It took about 50 years to get rid of Keynesianism or to roll it back. It's taken about the same amount of time to roll back the perfect competition doctrine. And it's been rolled back a lot in the last 50 years, but not enough, of course. Anyway, I'll now hand out the papers, the exams. Shift to that. You all did spectacularly well, almost too well. 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 You all did spectacularly well, almost too well.